I was standing in the kitchen doorway with a bottle of Pinot Noir in one hand when I heard my son raise his glass in the dining room and say the words that stopped my heart cold. "To Dad," Bradley said, his voice warm and easy the way it always was when he wanted something. "To Dad's last Christmas in this house." Someone laughed. Chris's laugh, bright and quick, the laugh of a woman who had rehearsed being delighted. I stood there in the hallway shadow with the bottle sweating in my palm, and I did not move and I did not breathe. And through the gap in the pocket doors, I watched my son clink his glass against his wife's and smile, the smile I had taught him to smile when he was 7 years old and needed something from his mother. "My name is Gerald Talbot. Everyone calls me Gerry. I am 64 years old, and for 31 years, I worked as a forensic document examiner for the Oregon State Police, which means I spent 3 decades of my professional life doing one thing better than almost anyone else in the Pacific Northwest. I looked at paper. I looked at ink. I looked at the pressure of a stroke and the hesitation in a signature and the specific tiny betrayals that a forged document always carries somewhere on its surface if you know exactly where to search. I testified in 340 cases. I taught a seminar at Portland State for 11 years on question document analysis. I retired 4 years ago with a pension, a modest house in Lake Oswego my late wife Eleanor and I had paid off in full, and a habit I never managed to shake, which was noticing things other people didn't know they were showing you. I had been proud of Bradley once. That pride had curdled slowly over the past 18 months into something closer to watchfulness, though I hadn't let myself name it that way until tonight. Eleanor had been gone 3 years that December, taken by a stroke on a Tuesday morning while she was watering the ferns on the back porch, and I had spent those 3 years learning how to live inside a house that still smelled faintly of her lavender hand cream in the hallway closet, no matter how many times I opened the window. Bradley was 38, our only child, a real estate developer who had built a small, glossy business flipping starter homes in Beaverton until the market corrected 2 years ago and left him holding 3 unsold properties and a construction loan that had ballooned past anything reasonable. I knew this because I had quietly pulled the county property records myself, the way I pulled records on everyone, out of habit more than suspicion, back when suspicion still felt like an ugly word to use about my own son. Christine, who everyone called Chrissy, was Bradley's wife of 9 years, a woman with a real estate license of her own and a smile that never once reached the specific muscles around her eyes. I had watched her work a room at Bradley's 35th birthday party the way a locksmith works a door, patient, methodical, checking every pin before committing to the turn. I had told myself for years that this was simply her manner, professional and a little cool, nothing sinister in it. I had told myself a great many things. Sophie was 7. Sophie was the reason I still put up the tree every year, the reason I kept the good china out of the cabinet from Thanksgiving straight through New Year's. The reason the house still felt, on nights like this one, like something worth walking into instead of simply enduring. Christmas Eve dinner had gone the way it always went. Standing rib roast, which I had learned to make from Eleanor's recipe card written in her looping cursive that I could still read blind if I closed my eyes. Sophie's paper snowflakes taped crooked to the dining room window. Bing Crosby on the record player, Eleanor had insisted on keeping instead of upgrading to anything with a Bluetooth speaker in it. Bradley had arrived with a bottle of wine that cost more than the last 3 bottles he'd brought combined, and Chrissy had arrived with a leather portfolio folder tucked under one arm that she set on the side table by the coat closet, with the particular care of someone setting down something breakable, or something that mattered a great deal more than its appearance suggested. I had noticed the folder. I notice folders. It is, God help me, the only skill I have left that anyone in this family finds even remotely useful. And even that usefulness had quietly ended the day I retired and stopped bringing home a badge that made people take my observations seriously. I had gone to get the second bottle of wine from the kitchen when I heard the toast. I stood in the hallway with my hand on the cold neck of the Pinot Noir, and I listened to my son's voice carry through the pocket doors with a warmth in it that I recognized now, too late, as performance. To Dad's last Christmas in this house, Bradley said again, and I heard the specific catch in Chrissy's laugh that told me this was not the first time tonight the sentence had been rehearsed between them. Somewhere in the car on the drive over, or in their kitchen the night before, or in whatever quiet room they conducted the business of my life without me in it. Bradley, I heard Chrissy say, low, a warning wrapped in silk. Sophie. She's watching the movie, Bradley said. Relax. I stood there for 11 seconds. I know it was 11 seconds because counting things precisely under stress is a habit 31 years of courtroom testimony beats into a man permanently, the way some men can't stop checking a locked door twice. I counted, and in those 11 seconds, 31 years of professional discipline did something for me that pure instinct alone might not have managed. It kept my face from changing. It kept my feet from moving. It let me stand in that hallway and listen instead of walking in and demanding an explanation I wasn't ready to hear yet. Because a man who reacts before he has evidence is a man who hands his opponent the exact information they need to cover their tracks. I walked back into the dining room 3 minutes later with the bottle of wine and a face arranged into the particular pleasant blankness I had spent decades perfecting for cross-examination. Bradley looked up at me and smiled his easy smile and said, "There he is. We were just talking about maybe doing the Fairmont for New Year's this year, Dad. Big family thing. What do you say?" "Sounds nice," I said, and poured the wine, and my hand did not shake, though something behind my sternum had gone cold and hard and very, very still. Sophie fell asleep on the couch during the second half of the movie, with a candy cane still clutched in one fist, and Chrissy carried her out to the car wrapped in the fleece blanket from the hall closet, while Bradley lingered in the front hallway pulling on his coat with the unhurried ease of a man who had accomplished something that evening and knew it. "Hey, Dad," he said, one hand on the doorknob. "Before we go, I've got something for you to look at. Boring adult stuff. Don't worry about it tonight. Just some paperwork from the accountant about the house insurance, and something from Mom's estate trustee about updating the beneficiary language. Nothing urgent." He reached into the leather portfolio Chrissy had left on the side table and produced 2 envelopes, cream-colored, identical in size. Unmarked except for a small typed label on each. He set them both on the entry table beside my keys. "Just sign where the tabs are and drop them in the mail whenever." "No rush, no rush," I repeated. "Merry Christmas, Dad." He hugged me, warm and firm, the correct length for a son embracing a father he loves, and I stood there with my arms around him and thought about the words "last Christmas in this house" sitting in my chest like a stone dropped into still water, the ripples still moving outward, long after the stone itself had disappeared beneath the surface. I closed the door behind him and stood in my own front hallway for a long moment, listening to his car back out of the driveway and disappear down the street toward wherever he and Chrissy were driving Sophie home to sleep off a Christmas Eve she would remember, someday as ordinary. 2 envelopes. Identical. Unmarked except for typed labels I hadn't had a chance to read in the doorway light. Nothing urgent, he'd said, and in 31 years of examining documents that other people desperately wanted signed without close inspection, I had learned that nothing urgent was very often the exact phrase men used to describe the thing that mattered most. I picked up both envelopes from the entry table and carried them into my study, and I turned on the good lamp, the one with the magnifier built into the arm that Eleanor had bought me for my 60th birthday, as a joke about my eyesight that had turned, over the years, into the single most useful object in the room. I sat down at my desk. I set the 2 envelopes side by side under the light, and I began, the way I had begun 10,000 times before, in a career I thought I had left behind me 4 years ago, to look very, very closely. The first envelope was addressed, in typed block letters, to Gerald Talbot, homeowner's insurance update. Inside was exactly what it claimed to be, a routine notice from my insurance carrier about a premium adjustment, requiring a signature to confirm receipt. Boring. Genuine. Entirely unremarkable, right down to the watermark in the letterhead paper, which I checked out of pure professional reflex and found perfectly consistent with the carrier's known stock. The second envelope was labeled Talbot Family Trust, Beneficiary Designation Update. I opened it slowly. The way you open something you already suspect is going to hurt you, and I spread the contents across my desk under the lamp, and I read every line twice, and by the second reading my hands, which had not shaken when I poured the wine, had gone very cold and very still in the particular way they used to go still in a courtroom right before I delivered testimony that was about to end someone's career. It was not a beneficiary update. It was a durable power of attorney, drafted by a law firm I did not recognize, granting Bradley Talbot full authority over my financial affairs, my property, and on a secondary clause buried on page 3 in the kind of dense legal language designed to be skimmed past rather than read, the authority to consent on my behalf to residential placement decisions in the event that a licensed physician determined I exhibited. And I am quoting the document exactly because I photographed it 40 minutes later, and I have read this sentence more times than I can count since diminished capacity for independent living. There was a signature line waiting for me at the bottom. There was a second signature line beside it, already filled in a doctor's looping scrawl I did not recognize. Above a printed name, Dr. Marcus Whitfield, and a medical license number I would spend the next 6 days verifying did not, in fact, correspond to any physician licensed to practice in the state of Oregon. I sat in my study at 11:40 on Christmas Eve, with a fabricated medical evaluation and a power of attorney my son had brought to my house, wrapped in the language of insurance paperwork, tucked inside an envelope identical in every visible respect to the harmless one beside it, and I understood, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful in its coldness, exactly what had been rehearsed in that dining room before I walked back in with the wine. He had not needed me to read either document tonight. He had needed me to sign both of them without reading either, the way a tired man signs 2 nearly identical forms handed to him at the end of a long evening by someone he trusts completely. One real, one a decoy in reverse, not to hide the dangerous document, but to normalize it, to bury it beside something boring enough that my guard would already be down by the time my pen reached the second envelope. I thought about the toast. To Dad's last Christmas in this house. Not a slip of the tongue. Not too much wine. A plan, spoken aloud in my own dining room, 20 feet from where I stood in the hallway holding a bottle I never got to open. I did not call Bradley that night. I did not call the police. I sat very still at my desk for a long time, the way I had learned to sit still in interview rooms while a suspect across the table talked themselves, slowly and without realizing it, into the exact corner I needed them in. Then I picked up my phone and I called the one person I trusted to help me build, quietly and completely, before anyone realized I had noticed anything at all. An answer to a question I had spent 31 years learning how to ask correctly. What is this document actually trying to prove? And who is it actually trying to protect? Sam Ruiz picked up on the third ring, his voice thick with sleep and the particular gravel of a man who had spent 26 years as a Portland homicide detective before retiring 2 doors down from me on Larchmont Drive 4 years ago, the same year I'd retired myself. We had bonded over lawn mowers and bad backs and the specific loneliness of men whose professional instincts never fully power down just because the badge gets turned in. "Gerry," he said, "it's midnight. I need you to come look at something," I said. "Tonight, if you can." There was a pause on the line, the particular pause of a man recalibrating from sleep to attention in under 3 seconds. A skill 26 years on the job never quite lets you lose. "Is it Sophie? Is everyone all right?" "Everyone's fine," I said, though even as I said it I understood that wasn't entirely true, and hadn't been for longer than I wanted to admit. "Bring your reading glasses, Sam, and bring the number for that elder law attorney your sister used, the one in Portland. I think I'm going to need her." He was at my door in 11 minutes, still wearing his slippers, and he stood in my study under the good lamp, reading the power of attorney twice through without saying a word, his jaw working the way it used to work. He told me once, right before he read a suspect their rights. "Gerry," he said finally, setting the document down with the careful precision of a man handling evidence he already knew would matter. "This physician's license number, let me guess. You already checked it. Doesn't exist," I said. "Not in this state." Sam looked at me for a long moment, and something in his face shifted from friend to detective, the transformation I had watched happen 100 times in interview rooms. Except this time it was happening on my behalf instead of against a stranger across a table. Then your son just handed you, he said slowly. On Christmas Eve, in your own house, an attempted felony. I looked down at the 2 envelopes on my desk, identical on the outside, worlds apart within. I thought about Sophie asleep on my couch 2 hours earlier with a candy cane melting in her fist. I thought about Eleanor's recipe card in the kitchen and the specific way she used to say, whenever Bradley pushed too hard for something as a boy, he gets what he wants because we let him, Gerry. And someday that's going to cost somebody more than we're willing to pay. He's not getting this house, I said. And he's not getting to decide where I sleep at night. But I'm not going to hand this to a lawyer wrapped in anger, Sam. I'm going to hand it to her wrapped in proof, the way I taught 2 decades of prosecutors to want their evidence handed to them. Complete, verified, undeniable. Sam picked up his coffee. Margaret, no, I caught myself. It was my own study, my own silence. And I was already 3 years past the point where I stopped correcting myself out loud for the small ways grief still rearranged the furniture of a sentence, and looked at me with the specific respect of one professional recognizing another. Where do we start? He said. I looked at the second envelope, the fabricated evaluation, the forged signature of a doctor who did not exist practicing medicine in a state where his license number belonged to no one, and I felt something settle into place in my chest that I hadn't felt with this particular clarity since the day I retired and set my badge down for the last time. We start, I said, with finding out exactly how long my son has been planning to make this Christmas the last one I ever spend in my own home, and then we make absolutely sure it is the last time he ever tries. Outside the study window, the snow had started again, drifting slow and silent past the porch light. Eleanor had insisted we leave on every winter night of our marriage, a habit I had never once considered breaking, and would not break tonight either. No matter what my son had decided 3 weeks ago in some quiet room I hadn't been invited into, that my future was going to look like, Pamela Ortiz arrived at my house at 9 the next morning, Christmas Day, in jeans and a wool coat, instead of the tailored suits I'd later come to associate with her courtroom presence, because Sam had called her the night before and told her, in the specific clipped shorthand of 2 people who had worked cases together for over a decade, that this one couldn't wait for the holiday to end. She was 52, sharp-eyed, with the particular economy of movement I recognized from the best expert witnesses I'd ever prepped, people who understood that wasted motion in a crisis was itself a kind of tell. She read both documents at my kitchen table without touching the coffee I'd poured her, the same way Sam had, and when she finished, she set them down and looked at me over the rim of her glasses. Mr. Talbot, she said, I need you to understand something before we go one step further. What you have here, on its face, is attempted fraud in the acquisition of financial control, potentially combined with the fabrication of a medical evaluation, which under Oregon law rises to elder financial exploitation regardless of whether the underlying transfer ever actually completed. The fact that your son brought this to you disguised as ordinary paperwork on a holiday, immediately following a private conversation in which he referred to this as your last Christmas in your own home, is not incidental. It's pattern. Predators build patterns. They rehearse. I'm not calling my son a predator, I said. And even as I said it, I heard how thin the sentence sounded coming out of my own mouth, the specific hollowness of a man trying to hold on to a version of a person that the evidence in front of him had already quietly retired. I understand, Pamela said, not unkindly, but I need you to hear the legal reality clearly, because the emotional reality is going to keep trying to talk you out of it for weeks. Someone drafted this document. Someone fabricated a physician's signature and a license number that doesn't exist. Someone chose deliberately to present it to you disguised inside routine paperwork on the one night of the year you'd be least likely to read it carefully. That is not a son who made a mistake, Mr. Talbot. That is a plan with a timeline, and the fact that the timeline includes a toast announcing its own success before it's even finished tells me your son believes, right now this morning, that it already worked. I sat with that for a long moment, watching the steam curl off my untouched coffee, listening to the specific silence of a house on Christmas morning, with no one in it but the three of us and the ghost of Eleanor's lavender hand cream somewhere in the hallway closet. "Then let's make sure he's wrong," I said. Pamela didn't move fast. That was the first thing I learned about working with her, and it was the thing that eventually saved everything. She explained, over the next hour, exactly how these cases collapsed when families moved too quickly: a furious father confronting his son over Christmas dinner, a shredded document, a shouting match that produced nothing admissible and gave the son 48 hours to destroy every other piece of evidence he'd built. What we needed instead, she said, was exactly what I had spent 31 years building for other people's cases, and had somehow never once considered building for my own life: a complete, silent, undeniable record, assembled before anyone on the other side realized they were being watched. "Don't sign anything," she said. "Don't confront him. Don't mention the envelopes. As far as Bradley knows right now, you set that folder aside to deal with after the holidays, exactly the way he expects a busy, trusting father to do. Let him believe that, for as long as it takes us to find out who drafted this, who forged that signature, and how many other people he's done this to before you." That last sentence landed harder than anything else she'd said all morning. How many other people? I hadn't let myself think that far yet. I had been so occupied with the specific, private devastation of my own son's betrayal that I hadn't stopped to consider the shape of Bradley's finances over the past 18 months. The 3 unsold Beaverton properties, the construction loan I'd pulled from county records out of habit, rather than suspicion, the leather portfolio Chrissy had carried into my house like something that mattered more than its appearance suggested. A man who fabricates a doctor and a legal document to gain control of his own father's estate is not improvising in a moment of desperation. He is executing a plan that required capital, contacts, and time, and men who build plans like that rarely build them only once. Sam had already pulled up the physician's license number on his laptop by the time Pamela finished her coffee, and he turned the screen toward us with the particular grim satisfaction of a detective who has just confirmed the worst version of a hunch. "Dr. Marcus Whitfield," he said. "Oregon Medical Board has no record of anyone by that name currently licensed, previously licensed, or under review. I ran the license number itself. It belongs to a retired podiatrist in Bend who's been dead since 2019. Someone photocopied a dead man's credentials," Pamela said quietly, "and typed a fictional name over them to make a fabricated evaluation look verifiable to a family member who wouldn't think to check. Which means," Sam said, "whoever drafted this document knew exactly how thin most people's due diligence is on medical paperwork. This isn't a first attempt, Gerry. This has the fingerprints of someone who's done this before and gotten away with it." I thought about that phrase for the rest of the day, gotten away with it, while Sophie's abandoned candy cane wrapper sat in my kitchen trash can, and the porch light burned steady against the gray Christmas afternoon outside my window. And by evening I had made a decision that would define the next 6 weeks of my life. I was not going to react to what had already happened. I was going to find out how far back this pattern went, and I was going to do it the way I had spent 3 decades doing everything that mattered, with patience, with documentation, and with the specific, cold discipline of a man who understood that the most dangerous people in any family are never the ones who raise their voices. They are the ones who raise a toast, smile through the whole meal, and hand you a signature line disguised as insurance paperwork on their way out the door. The following week, I did something I had not done in 4 years of retirement. I called my old supervisor at the State Police Forensic Lab, a woman named Denise Okafor, who had taken over the Question Documents Unit the year I left, and asked her, off the books and strictly as a professional favor between old colleagues, whether she'd run into anything recently involving a law office generating power of attorney documents with fabricated medical evaluations attached. "Funny you should ask," Denise said. "We had a complaint filed 8 months ago out of Washington County. Elderly widow, similar structure, fabricated capacity evaluation, forged physician signature. Power of attorney drafted by an outside consultant rather than the family's actual estate attorney. Case got dropped because the family couldn't prove intent before the widow's son withdrew the paperwork and claimed it was a misunderstanding. Do you have the consultant's name? I said. The one who drafted the outside paperwork. There was a pause on the line, the sound of a keyboard, the particular silence of someone deciding how far outside procedure they were willing to go for an old friend. I probably shouldn't be telling you this, Gerry, Dennis. Please. Firm called Meridian Family Advisory Group, she said finally. Registered address is a UPS mailbox in Teagard. No attorneys on staff that I could verify are actually barred in this state. The name on the incorporation filing is a woman named Christine Falk. I sat very still in my study with the phone against my ear, running the name through every version of my daughter-in-law's identity I had ever known. Christine Talbot. Christine Falk. A maiden name, or a shell, or both. Denise, I said slowly. I think you just told me my daughter-in-law's professional name. The silence on the other end of the line lasted 4 full seconds before Denise said, very quietly, Gerry, I think you need to talk to a lawyer who isn't me. I already had one. What I needed now was proof solid enough that Pamela Ortiz could take it somewhere it would actually matter. And proof, I had learned across 31 years and 340 courtroom appearances, was never handed to you fully formed. It was built, one verified thread at a time, by someone patient enough to pull each thread slowly instead of yanking the whole tapestry apart before it was ready to hold together on its own. Sam and I spent the first week of January doing what Sam called, with the particular dark humor of a homicide detective forced into early retirement, the boring part nobody puts in the movie. We pulled the Washington County case file through a public records request, careful to route it through Pamela's office so it wouldn't trace back to my name and tip Bradley off that anyone was looking. We found the widow, a woman named Ruth Holloway, 81, living alone in Hillsborough, and Pamela drove out to meet her, gently, over tea, and came back with a folder of her own documents, a power of attorney drafted by Meridian Family Advisory Group, a fabricated capacity evaluation from a Dr. Marcus Whitfield, the same fictional name, the same dead podiatrist's license number, right down to the same font in the letterhead. She almost signed it, Pamela told me that evening, sitting across from me at my kitchen table with Ruth Holloway's folder open between us, like an X-ray of a wound I hadn't known I shared with a stranger. Her son withdrew it after she got suspicious and called her sister. Nobody ever pressed charges. Meridian just closed that file and moved on to the next family. To us, I said. To you, Pamela agreed. Except your son made one mistake, Ruth Holloway's didn't. The toast, I said. The toast, she said. He announced the plan out loud, in your presence, before it was finished. Everything else about this operation is careful. That single sentence wasn't. And it's the reason we're not starting from nothing. I thought about Eleanor that night, sitting alone in the study with Ruth Holloway's folder still open on the desk beside the 2 Christmas envelopes. And I thought about the particular way she used to say, whenever she caught me working too late on a case that had gotten under my skin, you can't save everyone, Gerry, but you can absolutely make sure the ones you catch don't get to try it on somebody else. I had believed that sentence for 31 years as a professional principal. I had never once expected to need it as a father. Sophie's birthday fell on the 2nd Saturday of January, and Bradley and Chrissy hosted it at their house in Beaverton, a rented party space at an indoor trampoline park with balloon arches, and a soundtrack of pop songs pitched exactly loud enough to make quiet conversation impossible, which I understood now, watching Bradley move through the crowd of 7-year-olds and their parents with his easy, practiced warmth, was possibly not an accident. A loud room is a room where nobody overhears anything they shouldn't. I brought Sophie a gift, a telescope she'd been asking about since Christmas, and I watched her unwrap it with the particular unguarded joy that only children and very old dogs seem capable of anymore. And for 4 minutes, standing in that too loud room full of trampolines and balloon arches, I let myself simply be a grandfather instead of a man quietly building a case against his own son. Then Chrissy found me by the drink table, holding 2 paper cups of lemonade, and handed me one with a smile that did not, as always, reach the muscles around her eyes. Gerry, she said, did you get a chance to look at those forms Bradley left? The insurance thing? And the trust update? Nothing urgent, but our accountant's been asking. I looked at her for a long moment, this woman I had welcomed into my family 9 years ago, who had sat at my table for holiday after holiday, who had carried her daughter out of my living room wrapped in a fleece blanket on Christmas Eve, while her husband slipped a fabricated medical evaluation into my hallway, disguised as routine paperwork. And I thought about everything Pamela had told me about patience, about not tipping my hand, about building a record complete enough that when the moment finally came, there would be nothing left for either of them to argue their way out of. I've been meaning to get to it, I said, and I let my voice carry exactly the warm, slightly distracted tone of a man in his 60s who genuinely intended to deal with boring paperwork sometime soon and simply hadn't gotten around to it yet. You know how it is. New Year, everything piles up. Of course, Chrissy said, and something in her shoulders relaxed by a degree so small I would have missed it 4 years ago, before 3 decades of watching for exactly that kind of tell had rewired the way I saw every room I walked into. No rush at all, Gerry. Whenever you get a chance. I smiled at her over my paper cup of lemonade, and I thought about Ruth Halloway's folder sitting in Pamela Ortiz's locked filing cabinet in downtown Portland. And I thought about a man named Marcus Whitfield who had never existed, wearing the borrowed credentials of a dead podiatrist from Bend. And I thought, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful in its coldness, no rush at all. Because I had already stopped being the man they were planning around. I had simply not told them yet. The second thread came from a place I hadn't expected. 2 weeks after Sophie's birthday, on a gray Tuesday afternoon in late January, I received a call at my house from a woman who introduced herself as Priya Nair, a paralegal who had worked until 11 days earlier for Meridian Family Advisory Group. I got your number from Ruth Halloway, she said, her voice tight and careful, the specific tightness of someone who has spent a long time deciding whether to make a phone call and has finally, exhaustedly, decided to make it. She said you were looking into the firm. I need to tell you some things, and I need you to understand I'm scared to be telling you any of it. I sat down slowly at my kitchen table, the same table where Pamela had first laid out the true shape of what my son and daughter-in-law had built, and I listened. Priya had worked at Meridian for 14 months, hired through a job posting that described the company as an elder services consulting firm, and had discovered gradually over her first 6 months that the firm's actual business model consisted almost entirely of identifying financially vulnerable elderly homeowners through public property and probate records, approaching their adult children with a proposal to streamline estate transitions, and drafting power of attorney and guardianship documents supported by fabricated medical evaluations designed to survive a cursory glance but collapse the moment anyone checked a license number. Christine ran the operations side, Priya said. Bradley handled the family relationships, the sons and daughters, the ones who wanted an easier answer than actually caring for an aging parent, or who wanted control of the assets before the parent could change their mind about who got what. I typed up dozens of these files, Mr. Talbot. Dozens. I didn't understand what I was actually part of until I overheard Christine on the phone with someone about She stopped, and I heard her breathe unsteadily on the other end of the line, about a father in Lake Oswego. Their next one. I heard your name. I quit 4 days later. I closed my eyes and pressed my free hand flat against the kitchen table, the same table where Eleanor and I had eaten 10,000 ordinary dinners across 36 years of marriage. And I thought about the specific horror of hearing, from a stranger's trembling voice on the phone, confirmation that I had not been a father to my son's mistake. I had been a target on a list. How many families, I said. My voice coming out steadier than I felt, the courtroom discipline taking over the way it always did when the ground underneath me went soft. How many, total, that you know of? I can't say for certain, Priya said, but I kept copies. Of everything. I was scared, Mr. Talbot, and scared people sometimes do the one smart thing in the middle of a lot of frightened ones. I made copies of every file I typed before I left, and I've been sitting on a flash drive in my sock drawer for 11 days trying to work up the nerve to call anyone. Would you be willing, I said, to bring that flash drive to my attorney's office? The silence on the line stretched long enough that I thought the call had dropped. Then Priya said, very quietly, if it means people like Ruth Holloway stop losing their houses to people like Christine Falk, yes, I would. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time after we hung up, the winter light going gray and then blue outside the window. The porch light Eleanor had insisted on clicking on automatically at dusk, the way it had every evening for 36 years. And I thought about the two envelopes still sitting in the locked bottom drawer of my study desk. Identical on the outside, one boring and one built to end my independence. And I understood that what I was holding now was no longer simply a father's private heartbreak. It was a case. A real one. The kind I had spent 31 years learning how to build so that it could not be argued its way back apart. And for the first time since I'd stood frozen in my own hallway on Christmas Eve, listening to my son toast to my last Christmas in this house, I felt something underneath the grief that I recognized. With something close to relief, as purpose, I picked up the phone and called Pamela Ortiz. I think we just found Meridian's paper trail, I said, and I think it's bigger than just us. There was a pause on her end, the particular pause of a lawyer recalculating the entire shape of a case in real time. Bring her in tomorrow morning, Pamela said, first thing. And Gerry, I need you to prepare yourself for something. If this is what it sounds like, this stops being a private family matter the moment that flash drive comes through my door. This becomes a criminal referral. Multiple victims, multiple counts. Your son isn't just going to lose access to your estate. I know, I said. And I found, sitting alone in my kitchen with the porch light glowing steady against the dark outside, that I did know, completely, and that some part of me, the part that had spent 31 years believing that the truth, carefully assembled and correctly presented, was the only form of justice that ever actually held, had already made its peace with exactly where this was going to end. There's one more thing, Pamela said. The gala. I frowned. What gala? Bradley's real estate group is hosting their annual investor showcase at the Sentinel Hotel downtown, second week of February. 50-plus prospective investors, a lot of them retirees looking to put estate money into new development projects. I pulled the guest list this afternoon, Gerry, out of pure procedural habit. Her voice went very quiet and very level, the voice she used. I would learn over the following weeks, exclusively for the moments that mattered most. Ruth Holloway's name is on it, so are 4 other names Prius files flagged as prior Meridian contacts. I sat with that for a long moment, understanding exactly what Pamela was telling me without either of us having to say it out loud. Bradley wasn't simply managing his existing operation. He was preparing to scale it, publicly, in a ballroom full of exactly the kind of trusting, financially comfortable older adults his wife's firm had spent 14 months learning how to identify and dismantle. When exactly, I said. Is this gala? February 14th, Pamela said. Valentine's Day, Gerry. He's calling it a legacy of trust. I looked out my kitchen window at the porch light burning against the dark. 36 years of habit that Eleanor had built into the bones of this house, long before either of us had any reason to suspect our own son would someday need to be stopped. And I felt the last soft edge of doubt in my chest harden, finally, completely, into something with a shape I recognized from 3 decades of courtrooms. Then that's exactly where this ends, I said, in front of every single person he was planning to use it against. Detective Priya's flash drive turned out to hold 41 separate case files, each one built with the same template Christine had refined over 3 years. An aging property owner identified through public probate and tax records, an adult child recruited as an inside contact, a fabricated capacity evaluation carrying Marcus Whitfield's borrowed, dead credentials, and a power of attorney drafted to survive exactly the amount of scrutiny a trusting family member was likely to give it. 14 of the 41 files showed evidence the transfer had actually completed. Combined estimated losses across those 14 families, according to the forensic accountant Pamela, brought onto the case the following week, a quiet, exacting man named Robert Chen, who reminded me, in the best possible way, of every good financial witness I'd ever prepped for trial, exceeded $3.8 million. Your son and daughter-in-law didn't build this alone, Robert told me, spreading printouts across Pamela's conference table on a Thursday morning in early February, 11 days before the gala. There's a third party. Every fabricated evaluation carries the same forged signature block, but the notary stamps across different files trace back to two different individuals. One registered notary in Hillsborough who I believe was complicit, and one whose credentials were also stolen, the same pattern as the dead podiatrist. Someone in this operation understands exactly how thin institutional verification actually is, and has been exploiting that thinness for at least 3 years. I sat at the head of that conference table, with 14 families worth of quiet devastation spread out in front of me, and I thought about Bradley at 7 years old, standing in our kitchen after he'd broken a neighbor's window with a baseball, insisting through tears that it hadn't been his fault, and Eleanor kneeling down to his level and saying gently but without a trace of give in her voice, "Bradley, the truth doesn't get easier the longer you wait to tell it. It only gets harder for the people who trusted you." I wondered, sitting in that conference room 3 decades later, exactly when he had stopped believing that, or whether he ever had ageist Diane Kessler of the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit took the case 8 days before the gala, after Pamela made a call to a contact she'd worked with on a prior elder fraud prosecution, and the meeting that followed in a windowless federal building on 3rd Avenue was the moment the entire shape of what I was doing shifted, finally and completely, out of my hands and into a machinery larger and more careful than anything I could have built alone. "Mr. Talbot," Agent Kessler said, sliding a folder across the table toward me that contained, I would learn, printed stills from surveillance already quietly underway on the Meridian Family Advisory Group's Tigard mailbox address. "I need you to understand something about the timeline here. Your son and daughter-in-law believe, as of this morning, that you have not read either of those 2 Christmas Eve documents closely. They believe you are exactly the trusting, distracted father their entire business model depends on. That belief is the single most valuable piece of leverage we have, and I need you to protect it for 11 more days." "The gala," I said. "The gala," she agreed. "We believe Bradley intends to use the event to solicit new investment commitments from at least 5 individuals we've identified as prior or prospective Meridian targets, using a legitimate-sounding real estate fund as the vehicle. We also believe, and this is where I need your help, Mr. Talbot, that he intends to use your public presence and endorsement as a retired state forensic examiner with decades of institutional credibility to reassure exactly the kind of skeptical investor who might otherwise ask too many questions." I understood, sitting in that windowless room, exactly what she was asking, and I understood, with the same cold clarity that had carried me through 340 courtroom testimonies, exactly why I was going to say yes before she finished laying out the plan. "You want me to go," I said. "You want me to let him use me." "I want you to let him believe he's using you," Agent Kessler said, "for exactly as long as it takes my team to be in position. And then, Mr. Talbot, I want you to do the one thing your son has never once, in 3 years of running this operation, planned for." "Well, what's that?" I said. "React," she said, publicly, in front of every investor in that room. Because right now, his entire business model depends on nobody ever pushing back at the exact moment it matters. He has never had to build a contingency for a father who fights back in front of witnesses, because none of his prior targets ever had the standing, the knowledge, or the nerve to do it. I thought about Ruth Halloway, 81, alone in her Hillsborough living room, nearly signing away her home to a fictional doctor's signature because she trusted the son of a friend who'd referred her to Meridian. I thought about the 14 families whose files sat in Pamela's locked cabinet, people who had not had a retired forensic document examiner standing quietly in their hallway on the one night it mattered most. "I have the standing," I said. "I have the knowledge. And Agent Kessler, I promise you, I have the nerve." The 11 days between that meeting and the gala were the longest of my life since the week following Eleanor's stroke, and I filled them the only way I knew how. With preparation so complete, it left no room for the fear to find purchase. I met with Robert Chen twice more to understand the full financial architecture of what Bradley and Christine had built. I sat with Priya Nair for 6 hours across 2 afternoons while she walked me through every file she remembered typing, filling gaps the flash drive alone couldn't close. I visited Ruth Halloway in Hillsborough, unannounced, and sat with her at her kitchen table while she told me, in her own words, what it had felt like to almost lose the house her husband had built with his own hands in 1974. And I held her hand while she cried, and I promised her, the way I had promised no one anything in 3 years, that she would not be the only story that got told. And on the night before the gala, I sat alone in my study, with the 2 Christmas envelopes spread out under the good lamp, one final time, and I did the thing I had been quietly preparing to do since the second week of January, the thing that would, I hoped, close the loop my son had opened, the moment he set that leather portfolio down on my entry table. I had never mailed either envelope back. I had told Bradley twice now over the course of 6 weeks that I hadn't gotten around to it, and he had believed me both times, because a busy, grieving, trusting father forgetting to deal with boring paperwork was exactly the story he had built his entire operation to expect. But I had not simply been sitting on them. I had spent one careful evening in early January doing something I understood, even as I did it, was going to matter more than almost anything else I contributed to this case. I removed the harmless insurance notice from its envelope, and I removed the fabricated power of attorney from its envelope, and I switched them. Quietly, completely, resealing each envelope with the same steady hand I had used for 3 decades to handle evidence too fragile to disturb twice. The envelope labeled Homeowner's Insurance Update now contained the fabricated power of attorney and its forged physician's evaluation. The envelope labeled Talbot Family Trust Beneficiary Designation Update now contained nothing but a routine insurance form, and on that January evening I had signed the insurance form exactly the way Bradley expected me to eventually sign something, and mailed it back to the return address on the envelope, which was not, I had confirmed through Sam's contacts, my accountant at all, but a private mailbox registered to Meridian Family Advisory Group. Bradley believed, as of the night before the gala, that I had signed and returned his guardianship petition. He believed his forged evaluation was already in his wife's hands, filed, notarized, waiting only for the formal court submission he'd apparently scheduled for the week after Valentine's Day. He had no idea that what actually sat in Christine's file cabinet was a signed homeowner's insurance form, and that the real weapon he had built, complete with the dead podiatrist's stolen license number and a forged evaluation date, was locked in my study desk drawer, photographed, cataloged, and sitting in a federal evidence file 3 floors above a conference room on 3rd Avenue. He believed he had already won. That belief was the last quiet gift I intended to give him, right up until the moment it mattered most to take it away. The Sentinel Hotel ballroom on the evening of February 14th looked exactly the way $80,000 in event production could make a ballroom look. Chandeliers, a string quartet, a projection screen along the back wall, cycling through architectural renderings of the Meridian Collection. A boutique development fund Bradley had apparently spent the better part of a year building a legitimate-sounding shell around. 53 guests moved through the room in evening wear, most of them past 60, most of them the specific, comfortable, trusting demographic that had made my son and his wife nearly $4 million richer over the preceding 3 years. I wore my one good Navy suit, the one Eleanor had bought me for our 40th anniversary dinner 2 years before she died, and I stood near the edge of the room with a glass of sparkling water. I had no intention of finishing, watching Bradley move through the crowd the way he'd moved through my own dining room on Christmas Eve. Warm, easy, everything oriented invisibly. Around him, Aja Kessler's team was in position. 3 agents in evening wear scattered through the room, 2 more stationed near the service entrance, though I would not learn the full precision of their coordination until later. Sam stood near the bar, in a rented tuxedo that fit him the way a borrowed suit fits a man who has never owned one, speaking with apparent interest to a caterer who was, in fact, an undercover agent monitoring communications from the kitchen. Ruth Halloway sat at a table near the front, invited back by Pamela's office as a guest under careful protection, close enough to hear everything, far enough to stay safe. At 8:40, Bradley took the small stage at the front of the ballroom, and I watched my son deliver, with a fluency that turned my stomach, a 15-minute presentation about legacy, trust, and generational stewardship that used, at several points, phrases I recognized with a sick lurch as ones Christine's Meridian files had used, word for word, to describe the families they had already emptied. "And I want to close tonight," Bradley said, his eyes finding me at the edge of the room with the same warm, practiced smile he'd given me every Christmas of his adult life, by asking my father to say a few words. Some of you know Gerald Talbot's reputation. 31 years with the Oregon State Police, one of the most respected forensic document examiners this state has ever produced. Dad's reviewed our fund structure personally, and I can tell you, there is no one whose judgment I trust more. The room turned toward me. 53 faces, most of them older than me, most of them exactly the kind of trusting, financially comfortable people my son's business had spent 3 years learning how to identify and dismantle, waited for me to walk up onto that small stage and hand them, in front of witnesses, the exact credibility Bradley needed to close whatever commitments he'd already lined up for the following week. I walked to the stage. I felt 53 sets of eyes on me, and I felt Sam watching from the bar, and I felt, somewhere in the back of the room near the kitchen door, 3 federal agents watching with the specific stillness of people waiting for a signal. I did not give a speech about trust. "Thank you, Bradley," I said, taking the small microphone from its stand, my voice carrying clean and level across the ballroom the way it had carried across 3 decades of courtrooms. "I have reviewed the Meridian fund structure. I've also reviewed, over the past 6 weeks, 41 client files belonging to Meridian Family Advisory Group, which several of you may recognize as the consulting firm run by my son's wife, Christine Falk." I watched Bradley's smile falter 1 degree at a time, the way ice cracks under weight. It wasn't built to hold. "Those files document a pattern of fabricated medical evaluations, forged physician credentials, and power of attorney documents designed to transfer elderly homeowners' assets under circumstances that Federal Bureau of Investigation agents currently in this room are prepared to discuss with any of you directly." The room went absolutely, perfectly silent, the specific silence of 53 people simultaneously recalculating everything they'd believed about the evening they'd walked into 20 minutes earlier. "Dad," Bradley said, his voice dropping low, the warmth gone out of it entirely, replaced by something colder and more familiar, the same voice I'd heard through the pocket doors on Christmas Eve. "What are you doing?" "On Christmas Eve," I said, keeping my eyes on him, keeping my voice level. "You handed me 2 envelopes. One was routine insurance paperwork. The other was a power of attorney supported by a fabricated capacity evaluation, signed by a doctor who does not exist, using the stolen license number of a man who has been dead since 2019. You told me it wasn't urgent." I reached into my jacket pocket and withdrew a single folded page. The photograph I had taken of the forged document that Christmas Eve night at my desk under the good lamp, and held it up so the room could see it, though not, I made certain, close enough for anyone to read the details before Agent Kessler's team reached me. "I want you to know something before this room finishes deciding what tonight actually was. I switched those 2 envelopes in January. What you filed, what you believe you have on record as my consent, is nothing but a signed insurance form. The real document, your real document, Bradley, has been sitting in a federal evidence file for 11 days. Christine was already moving toward the ballroom's side exit before I finished the sentence, and I watched, from the small stage, as 2 agents I hadn't clocked among the caterers stepped into her path with the calm, practiced economy of people who had been waiting all evening for exactly this movement. "Christine Falk," one of them said, "I need you to come with us." Bradley stood frozen at the base of the stage, and for one long moment, I watched something happen behind my son's eyes that I recognized, with a grief I would carry for a long time afterward, as the exact absence of remorse I had spent 6 weeks quietly, hoping I wouldn't find. What I saw instead was calculation, fast, cold, already searching for the next angle, the way a drowning man searches for anything solid before he understands there is nothing left to grab. "This is a misunderstanding," he said, loud enough for the room, and I watched 53 faces, people who had walked in tonight ready to hand him their trust and their savings, watch him say it, and watch, one by one, their expressions change from confusion to something harder and more final. Agent Kessler crossed the room and placed a hand, not unkindly, on my son's shoulder. "Mr. Talbot," she said, "I need you to step outside with me." He did not resist. He did not raise his voice. He looked at me one final time across the width of that ballroom, and for a moment I thought I saw something crack behind the calculation, something that might, in another version of this story, have been the beginning of an apology. Then it closed again, and he turned, and he walked out with the agents on either side of him, and the ballroom doors closed behind them, and the string quartet, which had stopped playing somewhere in the middle of everything, did not start again. Federal prosecutors filed charges 11 weeks later: wire fraud, conspiracy, elder financial exploitation, identity theft related to the stolen physician credentials against both Bradley and Christine, along with 2 co-conspirators identified through Nair's files, including the complicit Hillsborough notary. 14 confirmed victim families were named in the indictment, with prosecutors indicating the true number, once all 31 years' worth of Meridian's operation had been fully traced, was likely closer to 20. Robert Chen's forensic accounting placed total confirmed losses at $4.1 million, of which federal asset forfeiture proceedings ultimately recovered $2.9 million, distributed back to victims including Ruth Halloway, who used a portion of her returned funds to finally repair the roof on the house her husband had built. I sat in the third row of the federal courthouse on 3rd Avenue on the morning of the plea hearing, 8 months after that Christmas Eve toast, and I watched my son stand before a judge in a gray suit and accept a sentence of 9 years, with Christine receiving 11 for her role structuring the operation and drafting the fabricated evaluations. Neither of them looked at me when the sentence was read. I had not expected them to. Sophie was 8 by then, and she did not attend the hearing, though Chrissy's sister, who had stepped in to care for her through the proceedings and afterward, brought her to visit me at the house in Lake Oswego every other weekend, an arrangement built slowly and carefully with Pamela's help and the family court's blessing, so that the one person in this entire story who had done nothing but unwrap a telescope on Christmas morning would not lose every single person who loved her. She sat with me in the backyard one Saturday afternoon that spring, looking through the telescope at nothing in particular in the pale daylight, and she asked me, with the specific bluntness only children seem to manage, "Grandpa, why did Daddy want you to sign the wrong envelope?" I thought about how to answer that honestly, in a way an 8-year-old could hold without it breaking her, the way I had spent months thinking about everything else in this story. "Because he thought I wouldn't look closely enough to notice," I said. "But I spent my whole life learning how to look closely, Sophie. And I think the most important thing I can teach you, more than anything about the stars in that telescope, is that noticing carefully isn't about catching people doing something wrong. It's about making sure the people you love can't be hurt by someone who's counting on nobody paying attention." She thought about that for a long moment, the way she thought about everything, with a seriousness that reminded me, painfully and gladly, of Eleanor. "So the 2 envelopes," she said slowly, "they were kind of like a magic trick, except you were the one who noticed the trick instead of falling for it." "That's exactly right," I said. "Good," Sophie said with the flat, satisfied finality of a child delivering a verdict. "Tricks are only fun when everybody knows it's a trick. If somebody doesn't know, it's not a trick anymore. It's just mean." I sat with that sentence for a long time after she went back to looking through the telescope, and I thought about 31 years of testimony, of forged signatures and fabricated evaluations, of Ruth Halloway's roof, and Nair's trembling voice on the phone, and a toast I overheard through a pocket door on Christmas Eve, and I understood that my 8-year-old granddaughter had just said, in 11 words, everything I had spent an entire career and an entire family learning the hard way. Sam still comes by most evenings, still complains about his lawnmower, still calls me 2 doors down from Larchmont Drive the way he has for 4 years, And some nights we sit on my porch under the light. Eleanor insisted on leaving burning every winter of our 36 years together. And we don't talk about the case at all. And that silence, too, has become its own kind of peace. I was not a hero in any of this. I was a father who almost signed away his own future without reading it, saved only by 31 years of professional habit, and a single toast I happened to overhear through a closed door at exactly the wrong right moment. What I want you to take from this, more than the envelopes, more than the gala, more than the sentence finally read in that federal courtroom, is this. The people most capable of hurting you are rarely strangers, and they rarely announce themselves with cruelty. They announce themselves with warmth, with easy smiles, with paperwork labeled nothing urgent, and the only defense any of us really have is the discipline to look closely at exactly the moment we're most tired, most trusting, and most inclined to simply sign where the tab says sign. If someone in your life hands you 2 envelopes and tells you not to worry about either one, read both of them anyway. Read them twice. And if what you find breaks your heart, remember that the truth, however late it arrives, is still the only thing sturdy enough to build a real Christmas on. If this story moved you, tell me one word in the comments that describes how you're feeling right now. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And subscribe, because the story I have for you next will stay with you long after it ends. A quick note before we continue. Certain details in this story have been shaped for narrative and educational purposes. If this isn't the content you came for tonight, no judgment at all. Take care of yourself, and I'll see you in the next one.